Okay, well, let's go ahead. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to P&P Live. I'm Brad Graham, the co-owner of Politics and Prose, along with my wife, Lissa Muscatine. And here with us today is a panel of three distinguished experts on military affairs, eager to talk about their thoughtful new book, Future of War and the Defense of Europe. A couple of brief housekeeping notes first, though. To post a question at any point, just click on the Q&A icon at the bottom of the screen. And the chat column will also be active, more for comments than for questions. But you'll also find a link there for purchasing copies of Future War of Europe and the Future of War and the Defense of Europe. The three men you see on the screen with me have combined more than 100 years of professional knowledge and experience in military and strategic affairs. John Allen is now president of the Brookings Institution, and previously he served nearly 4 decades in the Marine Corps, rising to the rank of 4-star general and commander of US and NATO forces in Afghanistan from 2011 to 2013. Ben Hodges holds the Pershing Chair in Strategic Studies at the Center for European Policy Analysis, and previously he served nearly 4 decades in the US Army, rising to the rank of 3-star general and commander of the United States Army Europe from 2014 to 2017. Julian Lindley French is a senior fellow at the Institute of Statecraft and founder and chair of the Alphen Group, an informal network of leading strategic thinkers. He's been a prominent advisor and strategist, held several professorial chairs, and written 11 books on military topics. The book these three have authored together, Future of War and the Defense of Europe, makes a compelling case that it's time to rethink European defense and come up with a new strategy for the security of Europe because of a number of trends. Many of these trends existed before the recent pandemic, but as the authors note, they've been accelerated by the crisis. The challenge isn't as simple as just modernizing European military forces. Instead, as the authors say, a new grand strategy must take shape in order to address such developments as lessened European cohesion, growing US commitments outside of Europe, mounting threats from Russia and China, and emerging technologies that are changing the nature of warfare. Among the elements of a revised strategy detailed by the authors are a new kind of Atlantic alliance, an innovative strategic public-private partnership, and a futuristic hyper-electronic European force. It's a bold vision, and we're about to hear it elaborated. So General Allen, General Hodges, and Professor Lindley French, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Brad, and it's lovely to be with you all, and good evening from the Netherlands where I live. You can see behind me my study. Let me put our book in a historical context. 80 years ago last month, there was a battle in the North Atlantic between a brand new German battleship and an aging British battlecruiser. And sadly, the British battlecruiser blew up, killing 1,415 men. She should not really have been there. She was unmodernized and too old for the battle she had to fight. And that was because decisions taken by British governments over decades since the 2 decades since World War I had left much of the British Armed Forces, not all, overstretched and simply under-technologically capitalized for World War II. And it took us a couple of years to catch up. And in a sense, the contention at the heart of the book is that unless Europeans in particular start to really modernize their armed forces and properly understand what it will take to maintain the peace in Europe, and in some ways, the book should be entitled Future Peace and the Defense of Europe, because this is a book about deterrence, about maintaining the peace in Europe, then we increase the risk of losing that peace, most notably because of the growing pressures on the United States, worldwide, and what is forcing the United States to spread itself across the globe as the guarantor of global peace. So in a sense, what the book is calling for, and you saw some of that in the NATO summit this week, which perhaps we can discuss in a moment, is a community of democracies, realistic in their appreciation of the world into which we are moving, understanding that we are engaged in a strategic competition, what's called great power competition, with the likes of Russia and China. And that if we are to collectively preserve the peace, not just in Europe, but beyond, it will be about the democracies standing together and with sufficient cohesion, political, technological, military, that over time we convince our adversaries that it's in their interest too to join the rules-based order and observe those rules. Because ultimately it is those rules that were born with the Atlantic Charter when President Roosevelt met Winston Churchill. A new Atlantic Charter was signed last week at the G7. Those rules are the best guarantor of peace, but those rules can only be preserved if we collectively defend them. John?
Well, thank you, Brad, as well. Thank you, Julian. It's great to see you. It's great to see you, Ben. I had to come all the way to Europe. I'm in my hotel room in Austria, and it is great to see everyone. So I apologize for the color. I've been trying to master the lights in my room, and I'm failing technologically. Julian has made several very important points, and one of the things that I would say is that we draw on history a lot when we went about the business of writing this book, and this book really began as a project several years ago that grew out of work that Julian did, I did, and some others. But Julian really led the effort in many respects on the adaptation of NATO for the future. And it flowed from the 2016 summit in Warsaw. NATO's done a lot of work in this regard. But that particular study really pointed us at the realities that deterrence was fraying, that the geostrategic environment in which NATO and the United States, of course, as a member of NATO, but more broadly, the US global environment had changed really very dramatically in just the last 15 years or so, with the rise of a near peer competitor, trending to being a peer competitor, with the rise of a technologically advanced Russia, the environment of cyber, which seems to be one of the dominant of the domains in which we must now operate, both in multi-domain warfare, but also cross-domain warfare. The realities of the speed and the nature of the change of technology, and how the nations of NATO and NATO as an entity can embrace these technological changes and do it in a manner that is a comprehensive, strategically planned embrace of these technologies that can give NATO as an alliance the kinds of technological edges that it will need ultimately to compete, to deter, compete with, and eventually, if necessary, fight in a highly advanced technologically environment, which will be multi-domain, which will be cross-domain. It will occur in the hybrid region of conflict. It will occur in, as I said, the cyber domain, very importantly, and we're engaged in that conflict even as we speak tonight. That conflict is raging in the cyber domain, in what we would call phase zero activities, aimed at the West, aimed at the United States, aimed at our allies. But we would see hybrid style of conflict, we would see operations in the cyber domain, and then we talk about something new called hyperwar. And as we see the advances occurring in supercomputing, computing power, the availability of data, the advance of algorithmic warfare, AI, we will see that warfare will begin to accelerate. And it will accelerate because the time from the decision to the action is going to decrease over time. And as that begins to decrease over time, as the speed of conflict continues to emerge, to continue to increase, we're going to be faced with some real challenges about how we technologically prepare for an environment of hyperwar. So as Julian said, the strategic environment has changed dramatically. Technology is advancing, not just advancing, but the rate of change is dramatic. And the domains in which we must operate and the types of conflict that we could conceivably have to wage, from hybrid to cyber to hyper war, all of those many different characteristics conspire now, I think, to make it very difficult in the current environment to create credible deterrence. And this is the area that we really pushed a lot of effort. Deterrence from the ability to make a decision, the linkage of our nuclear strategy, all the way through to the credible employment of conventional forces. We really have to think this through. Lots of great activity occurred at the NATO summit this week with the idea that we're going to move forward with a revised strategic concept. It's woefully overdue. And this is a very exciting moment, I think, for us to move forward, because many of these things that Julian just talked about, I'm talking about, and Ben will talk about in just a moment, many of these issues are going to find their way into this new strategic concept. And one final point, Julian touches on it, we'll hit it probably in this conversation, and that is societal resilience. And one of the challenges that we're going to face in an environment where the cyber domain of warfare touches every single person in our society, and the effects of COVID and the change in climate, all of those things have societal impact in ways that we have not seen before. And it's going to require that we not just think about our operational readiness, not just think about our modernization efforts, not just think about bringing the private sector in closer. It's about getting our societies ready as well for this new form of warfare in this new environment, in this new geostrategic environment that we live in. So thank you. And Ben, over to you, please.
Well, John, thank you. So I joined this effort partly because I have so much respect for my two friends, and I was excited to do anything with them. I would have joined them in a book about gardening if invited. But I also joined it because I believe that we are going to be in a kinetic conflict with China within 5 years. Kinetic meaning planes, submarines, ships, missiles, kinetic. Obviously, I hope I'm terribly wrong, but if we don't do, the collective we, the United States and our allies and our partners in Europe and in the Indo-Pacific region, if we don't do certain things, I believe that a conflict is inevitable. And the 5 years is based on the language I hear coming from Beijing now about Taiwan. The way that the Chinese Communist Party has smashed protesters in Hong Kong. The way that the Chinese People's Liberation Army Navy have fortified these artificial islands in the South China Sea, even though they told President Obama they would never do that. And there's nothing about the way that the Chinese do things these days gives me any confidence that they will live up to international law unless the United States, our European allies and partners, and our friends and partners in the Indo-Pacific region stick together. This is about competition, exactly what John Allen just said. And part of the reason we are where we are is because we did not compete. We did not compete in the economic domain, not the way the Chinese have, or the way the Russians are. We have not competed in the diplomatic sphere. We went our own way for a period of time, and many of our European allies have gone their own way and have not done what they should to ensure their own defenses were modernized and where they should be. Let me give a couple of examples of what we're talking about. It's in the news here in the last couple of days that the Chinese are about to acquire 30 to 40% of the control of the port of Hamburg in Germany. Now, that's not illegal, but the fact is they are significantly increasing their control over critical transportation infrastructure throughout Europe, which means that a government that violates international law, uses their own fishing fleet as an arm of their navy, and has threatened conflict over Taiwan and Hong Kong, is now going to be in control of a significant part of European transportation infrastructure. They already control the port of Piraeus. They're building a hub in Budapest. Thousands of rail cars end up in Duisburg, Germany on a weekly basis. Again, that's not illegal, but we've allowed ourselves into a situation now where we are very vulnerable because we have not competed and because we have not stuck together. And the Chinese certainly have tried to peel apart the EU with the creation of the so-called 17+1, where they've gone after the perhaps poorer or smaller and less developed countries of Eastern Europe, offering incentives to them to peel them away from the European Union. And they've also been able to invest in Czech government, the Hungarian government, the Greek government, to get those countries to water down condemnation by Europe against some of the illegal activities of the Chinese Communist Party. And then today, Prime Minister Draghi of Italy was threatened that if Italy did what he plans to do, which is to withdraw from some of the entangling economic relationships Italy is in now with China, that zero Chinese tourists will come to Italy, zero market for Italian goods in China, and zero parts or supplies coming from China to Italy. This is sort of what you might call the nuclear option in an economic standpoint being used by China or threatened by China against Italy. I think part of this competition, and that's what this is about. This is about the defense of Europe, that the United States and the EU, other countries of the EU, should immediately step forward and tell Prime Minister Draghi, don't you worry. We will make good whatever China takes out, the rest of us together will make good. Otherwise, China will, like Pac-Man, work its way through Europe and from an economic standpoint. At the same time, Russia in the greater Black Sea region. I live here in Frankfurt, Germany, after I retired from the US Army. I could hear the sighs of relief coming all the way from Berlin and Brussels and Paris and London after the Russian defense minister 7 weeks ago said, okay, the exercise is over in Ukraine, everybody go back to your barracks. I mean, people were so relieved, but of course it was a total, complete fairy tale. They didn't send anybody home. All the equipment, the people are all there, but they were so sure that we would lose interest and do anything to avoid a conflict. And so now we're going to be looking at a long, hot summer in Ukraine. Russia's biggest exercise of the year, upheld, takes place in September, and all of that stuff is still there. And all they're looking for is a provocation from Ukraine to justify their action. Or they're even citing, and John Allen talked about climate change, there's a drought in Crimea, and they're blaming the Ukrainians for blocking a water canal that goes from the Dnipro River down into Crimea. And they're blaming them, and they say, well, for humanitarian reasons, we may have to do something about this. So this is the kind of, this is who we're dealing with. And I was very proud of our president over the last 7 days as he worked his way through G7, NATO summit, EU summit, and then met with President Putin yesterday. And I'm sure if you're sitting up tonight listening to a book launch about future war, then you're also probably the kind of person that was watching the press conferences from President Putin and President Biden yesterday. And everything that they talked about is something that we've addressed in this book. Cyber, the importance of allies, living up to international order, to international law, being prepared. If President doesn't know that NATO is prepared, then it's much more difficult for him to stand there and tell the president of the Russian Federation, you better behave. Julian.
Thanks, Ben. There's a question implicit in this discussion is, why does it matter to Americans? Sitting as a Briton who lives in the Netherlands, it matters to Americans very great deal, and the book really addresses those issues. Last week we saw this signing of the new Atlantic Charter. The first Atlantic Charter took place at a pivot in history. The old European imperial age was coming to an end, and the age of the Atlantic was beginning, led by the United States. Implicit in what happened last week is a recognition that a new age is now starting, what I call the free world age, in which the United States is saying, look, we'll still lead, but we need you, the allies, to step up to do far more, not just for your own defense, in this common effort, but also as part of a collective effort to maintain the supremacy of the rules-based order. And what we do in the book is, so many books and other reports in the past have pulled their punches about what the worst case could look like. What would be the worst thing that could happen? And we're clear about that in the book. The worst case scenario for the United States and its European allies, and indeed allies the world over, would be engineered crises in the Indo-Pacific, simultaneous crisis in the Middle East, possibly the Arctic, and an opportunistic crisis engineered by Russia in Europe, in which the United States simply cannot be in strength in all places all of the time. The only group that could really make American policy credible as a deterrent worldwide, and indeed in Europe, preserve the security guarantee that America has afforded Europe since the end of World War II, or since the founding of NATO, certainly in 1949, is if Europeans do far more for their own defense. We're the change agent. We could and should do far more for our own defense. And if we do, that will ease pressure on the United States and its superb armed forces. The danger is that we don't do that. And you Americans are forced to make difficult choices that actually weaken you as you try to offset our weakness in Europe and maintain strength elsewhere. I was struck listening to Ben just now, talking about the situation on the Ukrainian border, which is extremely serious. And Ben's absolutely right. And I was struck by that image of Neville Chamberlain coming back from the Munich conference in 1938 at Croydon Airport, brandishing a piece of paper, talking about peace in our time. And less than a year later, we were at war. Now, I'm not suggesting for a moment we're going to be at war within a year. But we Europeans in particular, but Americans and Europeans together, must not be complicit by increasing the risk of such conflict by indifference and by negligence. Change is taking place. And what was uplifting this week at the NATO summit was to see so many of the issues addressed in the book in the NATO summit declaration: a new cyber defense policy, a new innovation fund, a new defense and deterrence concept, a recognition that China matters to NATO. Because why? Because anything that weakens the United States weakens NATO. Anyone who says that China does not matter to NATO is brain dead, frankly, because the United States remains the core of NATO. But ultimately, this comes down to the sharing of burdens and risks in a common effort to maintain the rules-based order. Things have changed, and we have to change too if we are to preserve the peace. And that is the essential message of a book that I had great pleasure co-writing with John and Ben. John?
Yeah, let me come back to a couple of things that have been said already. I just came minutes ago, really, from a terrific conference run by an entity called GlobeSec out of Bratislava. And it's one of the largest security conferences in Europe, right behind Munich Security Conference, actually. And what was very interesting, first of all, the numbers of folks who had read the book, and I'm not plugging it, but in a way I am, the numbers of people who had read the book and found that it was useful for the moment of the Biden administration arriving to the continent, bringing with the administration an assurance that the United States was back in the context of supporting a transatlantic relationship, supporting NATO and Article 5, which is an attack on one is an attack on all. Very, very clearly supporting what Julian said, which is really important, and that is that the future for the community of democracies is a future where we have to work together. We ultimately have to leverage our common values, and those common values are on display every single day between North America and Europe. Those are known. But often the conversation revolves around something called the West. And I often believe that the term the West is an exclusionary term in many respects. Because when you think about the democracies in the world today, which are not in residence in North America or in Europe, the very vibrant democracies, the economically powerful, technologically advanced democracies for whom human rights and the rule of law and equal rights are Equally as important it is for this audience are in East Asia, South Korea, Japan, Singapore, Taiwan. You know, we get this, that Taiwan is part of China in the context of a one China policy. We have made that policy concession to the Chinese, but Taiwan is a very vibrant democracy. Australia, New Zealand, and very importantly, and it's a name that's often not covered, is India.
Yeah.
And when you just aggregate the percent GDP, global GDP of North America, Europe, India, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and South Korea, it's half of the world GDP, far in excess of the Chinese. So the issue that we talk about is the advance of this issue of the community of democracies. And Julian has made a very important point. Look, with the rise of a near-peer competitor in East Asia, which has implanted itself in very influential ways in Europe. Ben talked about 17+1. If you don't believe that 17+1 is in fact targeted directly at the cohesion of the EU, a Chinese-led arrangement of 17 countries plus China, intended ultimately to reduce the influence and the coherence of the EU, you really just have to think about it again. And there was a very interesting point that was made by a very senior European politician on a panel that I was on, as he listened to Biden, President Biden, as he listened to the conversation in the G7 and at the NATO summit and with the EU, and he said, something interesting is happening here. The American view of the center of gravity of its security is shifting to the east. Clear American endorsement of the transatlantic relationship and the NATO alliance and the EU as an organization, a friend and an ally, not the number one foe, as Trump once called it. Yet we are inevitably, irrevocably pulled to the east in our attention because of the rise of China. And I don't go to bed at night and I don't get up in the morning thinking we're going to go to war with China on this particular day, but I do believe that deterrence in East Asia relies on a larger American presence. And that's very clearly the conclusion that Washington has come to. And so as Europeans pick up the reality that the American center of gravity with respect to how it will array its combat forces and how it will modernize its combat forces are in fact in very real ways influenced by the rise of China. The conclusion then of our European allies are, we have got to do more because the United States is simply going to be stretched too thin. We are stretched too thin. We're gonna have to make decisions, hard decisions about, we're in Europe, we're in Middle East, we're in East Asia. We're gonna have to make hard decisions about where we're going to be because we're malpositioned right now. We're gonna have to make hard decisions about our modernization because technology, the race of technology that has been embraced by our opponents is really dramatic. And so this is this moment that Julian has talked about and Ben has talked about. This is this pivotal moment where the change in the geopolitical and geostrategic environment, the rapid change of technology, the nature of warfare, the vulnerabilities of our population, the rise of the challenge of climate, those are intersecting challenges that no American president has had to deal with. And then of course, domestically, President Biden has got to deal with COVID, he's got to deal with the economy, he's got to deal with a national reckoning on race, long in coming, but now he's gripping it. And he's got to enunciate a foreign policy that is relevant to the middle class. So in terms of the full plate of challenges that any president has had in a very long time, President Biden's got a full plate. And part of that full plate is to establish a multilateral relationship overseas in a way that doesn't break the United States as it attempts to emerge from COVID, brings along the community of democracy, responds to the growing geostrategic challenges in East Asia and the threat in Europe, and of course deals with the issue, the inevitable issue that we're all going to have to deal with, which is climate.
Yeah.
And all of that is enormous. And the book talks about how we can no longer avoid having to face these realities. And if we're going to have credible deterrence, and weak deterrence or discontinuous deterrence is almost certainly a provocative posture in and of itself. If we're going to have credible deterrence, we have got to spend the kinds of money We've got to go in, we have to work through the right kinds of requirements development process. We have to bring the private sector in ways we've never done before.
So I won't make a comment, but I'm looking at the questions and coming up from the audience.
Yeah.
And the very first question, actually, before Brad even comes back on, I'm going to give John, you and Julian a chance to take just a second and look at that first question, because I think both of you would have a view of what type of leader do we need to take this on, not just for now, but for the next 10 years or so. What type of leader, what are the sort of talents? Because, you know, as I watched our president in Europe going through the G7, going through the NATO summit, talking to the EU leadership, and then of course yesterday with President Putin, there were so many positive outcomes. I mean, so many things that what NATO summit agreed to, great statements from the EU. But of course now, exactly as the president said, the proof is in the pudding. What are people actually going to do now that the summit's over and we're heading into the summer? And the president also said, you know, we'll know in 3 to 6 months whether or not Vladimir Putin is a person with whom we can actually have a meaningful strategic dialogue. We'll know in a few months. So this really comes down to a leadership question, I think, because we're going to ask people to spend a shitload of money on security and doing other things when there are so many competing demands. Julian, do you mind what you think? What kind of leader do we need? And then, John, if you would give a view, you've got a little bit of experience on leadership.
Thanks, Ben. Yeah, I mean, you know, like both of you, I've worked with many leaders over several decades, mainly British leaders, of course, but European leaders and American leaders. Let me give you an anecdote, if you like. Years ago, whenever the UK held a major nuclear exercise, the Prime Minister would play the Prime Minister. And there was nothing quite so sobering as watching a political leader who'd cut their teeth on domestic issues, because that's where in democracies, that's where our politicians focus 95% of their time, and rightly so. But you watch a politician who's suddenly faced with the option, or no other option, than unleashing an awesome nuclear deterrent as a final act. And it focuses the mind. And the reason they played themselves, both the ministers and the Prime Minister would play themselves in that role, was precisely so that they understood the gravitas and the weight of office in geopolitics. Now, since the end of the Cold War, that's stopped. Normally, that role is played by a civil servant or even an external person like me. And it's just about making the system function. Well, there was a period in the immediate aftermath of the Cold War when perhaps we could get away with that. But what we need are leaders that are willing and able to grip the seriousness of the moment. Understand that they have to make tough choices because of that seriousness. And frankly, tell their peoples things that are uncomfortable. For example, there's an instinct as we move into the post-pandemic period to what I call ambulance chase, which is to shift more money into not having the same pandemic again by strengthening our health services against such an occurrence. It's a standard classic response to a shock. Well, yes, we have to make sure that we make our societies more resilient against that particular shock, but we also have to recognize that we have to invest in defense and other structures to avoid the very kind of scenarios which John, Ben, and I are talking about in the book. Now, that requires tough choices for countries under strain economically and socially because of COVID. And that is leadership. That is a test of leadership. And the question for many Europeans, many of our European leaders here never knew the Cold War. They've grown up in a completely different age. Their test will be to agree that this is their responsibility and to act on it. And that is why I think President Biden's visit this past week has been so important, because it wasn't just about his presence. It was about his tone and the agenda he challenged European leaders with. And I very much hope that President Biden, in his particular manner, will hold European leaders to the commitments that they've made, because they need to. John?
Well, I think you covered it well, Julian. But the question is really important. And it is, we're not going to solve any of these problems without leadership. And I would commend to the audience, and it's online, you can find it. Once you have read our book, I would commend you going to the internet and pulling off something called the Interim National Security Strategy Guidance. Now, this was issued by the Biden administration very early in the administration, and most administrations take a couple of years to get their national security strategy issued. This one came out within a couple of months. And one of the reasons is because the administration is full of national security authorities and experts. But to the question, what you see immediately is such a departure from the last administration. So what shoots through the entire document, what gets your attention right away, is a foreign policy that is based first and foremost on values. It talks about multilateralism in the context of let's mobilize the democracies, those entities, those political entities in the world today that embrace and celebrate values. Because if you go to Freedom House, if you go to that website and look at Freedom House, the democracies in the world, those people who are governed by functioning democracies have decreased over the last several years. And the decrease has been consistent over well over a decade of the, if you will, the rise of illiberalism, the rise of autocrats, the rise of authoritarians. And there's only one way to push back on that, and that is for the democracies to organize in a way, first and foremost, that masses their values, that derives economic strength from their capacity to work together, from trade, from multilateral organizations, from aggregating the awesome technological capabilities that most of the modern democracies have, and do it in a way that actually is intended to make life better for the people who live in democracies, for the good of all humankind, but also do it in a way that permit us as a community of democracies to compete and to defend ourselves, if you will, not militarily necessarily, but to compete in a way where the Chinese ultimately do not have the technological high ground, where the Chinese, with their what they call authoritarian capitalism, which they believe and they tout as an alternative to the United States, which they say is a failing state by virtue of the problems that we've had over the last 4 years. The authoritarian capitalism is actually quite attractive in places in the world, because that model is followed up with a lot of money. And as Ben said a minute ago, this new idea of debt trap diplomacy, where the Chinese make an economic investment, and then suddenly the nation itself finds that its decision-making discretion is limited enormously by the Chinese economic influence. So this book isn't about China, but in many respects, it is preparing for a world where Europe is under threat, and where as China becomes a more prominent global competitor, not just in East Asia, but a global competitor. We have to be ready. And the United States is going to have responsibilities in East Asia. And as those responsibilities become bigger, as the Chinese become more potent, it's going to pull more of the American attention, more of the center of gravity towards the East, and the absolute necessity that Europeans see the need for their operational readiness, their programs for modernization, and to have a coherent strategy, which NATO is absolutely committed to doing, having a coherent strategy that embraces the new technologies and brings in the civilian community in terms of resilience and increases consultation. This is an absolute imperative now. And the 14th of June, the NATO summit, was a moment where NATO felt about itself in ways it hadn't in many years. NATO committed itself to revising within a year the strategic concept that embraces all of those many new changes that we have to exercise. But also NATO, I think now is more keenly aware of the deficiencies in its spending, ultimately in a coherent way to create the kinds of continuous integrated deterrence that is necessary to truly deter. Let me just make a final point. When Europe and the United States settled down for the holidays, for Christmas, in December of 1913, no one in front of their hearths on that day could have imagined that in 5 years, 5 years later, 20 million people would have died in a war in Europe, with 20 million more left homeless, the economies of multiple states crushed. No one could have imagined that in 5 years, the circumstances of civilization could spin out of control the way they did. With technology increasing the velocity and the acceleration of war, with Russia having changed the borders of 2 states in Europe by force kinetically in the first 2 decades of the 21st century. When people tell me that it's not possible for us to go to war, I tell them, you've got to think very hard about this, because that mentality alone undermines our deterrence. And when we have continuous integrated deterrence that embraces the new technology that we have today, we are far safer, and there's far less likelihood that we will go to war. And by the way, it's much cheaper to spend on deterrence than to spend on conflict and then to recover from it. And that's the point of the book.
Brad.
We can go to the other audience questions. I want to ask my own though first, and while you're answering that, maybe some others will jump in and add to the questions in the Q&A column. If you have a question, just click on Q&A and type it in. But my question keys to something that you say at the beginning of the book, which is that, you know, a number of these trends, whether it's Russia and China, climate change and so on, they existed before the pandemic, but they were exacerbated and accelerated as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. And your first chapter is actually about COVID-19 and the European defense dilemma. Talk a little bit about what the defense implications have been of the pandemic.
Shall I take that, chaps?
Sure, please.
Yeah, I mean, there's an interesting parallel, Brad, with European history. In 1347, we had the Black Death. And what the Black Death did was weaken certain countries, which were aristocracies, and strengthen others. And it actually triggered the 100 Years' War between France and England. And you saw the battles of Crécy, of Agincourt, of Orleans, which happened thereafter. It also changed the nature between the individual and power. And there's no reason to believe that this crisis will not do similar things. You've seen a massive exponential expansion of debt taken on by many European countries, or many of them already in debt, deeply in debt, which, for example, is undermining the Eurozone, because the Eurozone is governed by certain rules which require the limitation of debt to GDP, deficit to GDP ratios. So first, the ability of states to function as states when burdened with such debt is brought into question. Second, most European states are welfare states. I live in the Netherlands, which is a very it functions very well, but it's a welfare state, and much of its GDP is committed to maintaining that welfare, which is now threatened because of debt. And third, because politicians are elected in Europe on the basis of to what extent they can preserve the welfare of the individual, social security, health security, all the things that make the contemporary European state the European state. What they've done since the end of the Cold War is basically use defense budgets as a contingency fund to move money away from defense to fund other areas of social security. There'll be a great temptation for that to be accelerated because of debt that is borne by so many European countries. For the past 20, 30 years, we've got away with it because there's been no existential external threat that forced that choice. Now that choice is clearly there. Just at the moment of post-pandemic recovery, just at the moment we have to build resiliency into our societies. just at the moment when people protection is as important as the power projection of contemporary defense, political leaders in Europe are going to be faced with a very profound problem, which is how to increase the credibility of our defenses at a time when the resources available to increase that credibility are extremely limited, and meet all the other public goods which society has got so used to and will demand. And it goes back to that leadership point. There's going to have to be some very hard home truths spoken by European leaders to European peoples. My experience of working with many European leaders is that some of them will not rise to that challenge. They'll be very good at making declarations, of signing summit pledges, but actually going to their people and say, ladies and gentlemen, I'm sorry, but we've now moved into a different era, and the things that you have gotten used to, you're going to have to shift your thinking on. That's going to be a profound challenge for European leaders in the coming years.
How about
Brad?
the specific threat of biological warfare? Are we maybe better prepared now to deal with it, having gone through the COVID-19 virus, even though that wasn't, by most accounts, an actual, a virus engineered to purposefully kill so many of us?
Well, I'll let John and Ben come in here in a second. I don't want to hog the screen, but look, central to the book is this idea of hybrid warfare. Hybrid warfare systematically analyzes the vulnerabilities of an adversary. So whatever we do in response to COVID-19, whether it is building up health systems or whatever, and remember, the World Health Organization on the eve of the pandemic said that the UK and the US had the two most effective pandemic response systems. The problem was they were focused on the wrong pandemic. They were focused on a flu rather than a SARS-based pandemic. So an adversary would simply be looking at the massive vulnerabilities that European societies in particular have, and working out how best to exploit them, and tailoring their efforts, short of all-out war, to create the chaos in such a way that they would benefit. So I'm afraid it ain't that simple, to put it simply. John?
Well, I think Brad's question is good, and I would certainly agree with you, Julian. Biowarfare or bioterrorism doesn't have to wipe out entire populations. The enormous social disruption and dislocation that would occur from a bioterror event that created large numbers of fatalities would be so disruptive of a society as to be very difficult even to describe. And in the book, we talk about artificial intelligence a lot, and we use the term emerging technology a lot. Implied in the term emerging technology, but we don't spend a lot of time on it, but it deserves a lot of time going forward, is the whole issue of the bioengineering activities underway with respect to the potential for biological warfare. But we should be very attentive to that, because if you don't like what hyperwar will do to conflict in the context of algorithmic war supported by supercomputing, the whole idea of biotechnological war is frankly quite disturbing, quite frightening.
We shouldn't be too despondent about this. My own country, the UK, is a world leader in life sciences. Our response to the pandemic with the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine. Collectively, we also have a whole range of assets that do enable us to respond, but we need to invest in those assets and have a proper understanding how they can be applied.
So go ahead.
Sure, the Chinese and Russians did not slow down one bit during all of this. So it's a weak read for governments to lean on and say, well, we'd like to do more on defense, but we have to address COVID.
Yeah.
All the threats that existed before this are still there. The Chinese continued building ships. They continued carrying out all their malign activities. The Russians actually increased what they were doing during COVID. So we have to face the threats as they are, not as we wish they were. One of the negative outcomes of this whole thing, of course, is how much people lost confidence and trust in their own government because governments in many countries so politicize the event. You were a patriot if you didn't wear a mask, or if you did wear a mask. And then, of course, we've all seen endless, sickening videos of people inside shops and restaurants yelling, saying, you know, F you, I'm not going to wear a mask. I mean, these things that are really sickening to watch. But you can be sure that people sitting in Moscow and in Beijing are watching that, and that presents very, very vulnerable targets at which they aim their disinformation and division efforts.
Speaking of politics, here's a question from Robert in the audience. What would you say to progressives who would argue that everything you're saying is an excuse to increase an already bloated military budget? Robert says, I agree with you, but many of my liberal friends would be deeply suspicious of everything you're saying.
Well, my response
Well, that's
would be,
the nature of
sorry,
a democracy.
Yeah.
And I welcome those comments, because those kinds of comments force us into the analysis and the capacity to be able to explain our spending. The United States, in many respects, is going to have to think very seriously about the legacy systems that compose much of our military. The kinds of ships that we have, the systems on those ships, the kinds of vehicles from which we fight, the kinds of aircraft that we employ. If we're truly going to be able to embrace the technologies of the future, we're going to have to think in some pretty revolutionary ways. So I don't know necessarily that there will be additional bloat, to use that term, with respect to the defense budget, but we may well see. And there's been some pretty substantial commentary about the most recent Biden, the first Biden defense budget. There are some significant dollar figures in there about the kinds of conversions necessary within the defense budget for the United States to modernize in ways that embrace the kinds of technologies that we'll be encountering in the future. And I want to be very careful about saying, do we need 10 carrier strike groups? Do we need the X number of versions of 5th generation aircraft? Do we need tanks? Do we need Abrams fighting vehicles? You know, those are binary conversations that we often end up in. And the answer is, we need some of all of that. But given the environment within which we're going to be conducting multi-domain and cross-domain warfare, from space right down to an infantry assault, do we have the right combinations of systems and the right kinds of people? And are we properly leveraging the kinds of technologies that are going to define and in many respects influence the battle space for the rest of this century? And the answer is, we're behind. We're way behind. And if you think we're behind, our European partners, in many respects, aren't even on the field. And they know that.
I would add, first of all, I would say that I see myself as a progressive in many ways. And I make a distinction between progressives and those who deny war is any longer a possibility. Look, my response would be, first, this is about a minimum deterrent. It's not about a world-conquering military power. It's a minimum deterrent. Second, anyone who asks those questions has a fundamental right as a taxpayer to understand that their governments spend well. So before we suddenly spend an awful lot more on defense, and Britain, for example, is about to increase its defense budget by 10%. And given how inefficient Britain's defense expenditure has been in the last 20 years, I would hope that we become better defense spenders, not just bigger defense spenders. That kind of rigor that such a question should impose on our leaders is correct, because too often defense establishments have become bloated in the sense of wasting taxpayers' money at will, and that will have to end. So the imposition of rigor on the defense process, I would fully welcome.
And this is all enormously pressurized by the outcome of COVID and the kinds of spending that was necessary ultimately to stabilize economies and to recover the health of society. Yeah. This is all massively pressurized by that environment as well.
So here's a question from Anonymous. The US and other European democracies are seriously divided internally, and the US is in grave danger of losing its democracy, given Republican voter suppression efforts and filling state governments with Trump lackeys who will administer and certify 2022 and 2024 elections. Anyway, you know where that's going. The question is, how can the US and NATO put up an effective united front to Russia and or Chinese aggression when they are so internally divided?
Well, it was interesting when President Biden and Putin had their conversation the other day. And when President Biden criticized President Putin for imprisoning Alexei Navalny and cracking down on dissent in the streets, Putin said, hey, I'm taking the steps necessary to prevent a 6th January crisis in Russia. I'm taking the steps necessary to prevent a Black Lives Matter organization from arising out of the Russian population. And so, Brad, your question, and that question implies that until we get our own house in order, those difficulties become the handles that our opponents use against us as we go forward. And I would applaud the question. We've got terrible polarization in these democracies right now. And again, in the GlobeSec conference, we talked about it constantly. The hollow nature of populist leadership who promise everything and can deliver nothing, but increase the frustration of populations and ultimately the despair and a loss of trust in governmental institutions. And this, our administration and our European partners we've got an enormous amount of work to do on reconciliation and healing, et cetera. And my own institution, Brookings, is spending a lot of time on that today. But reconciliation and healing doesn't come out of Washington. It can't, because in so many respects, the capacity to have the bipartisan or the nonpartisan conversation is very difficult. If you're a politician in Washington and you seek to become a bipartisan, in many respects, you're often considered by your party to be a traitor, or you're considered to be weak. And we didn't arrive here on the 5th of January. So the 6th of January was somebody got a good idea, let's storm the Capitol. That all didn't come to people's minds on the 5th. This has been years in the building. And not just Trump. Trump gets a lot of credit for having been one of the most divisive leaders in American history. But it was in years in the building, and it's going to take years to get it fixed. And that's the challenge that the democracies have. But we shouldn't despair that our democracies in the end stand for values, and that we are far stronger and far more able to resist the autocrats and the illiberals and the authoritarians who would take away our freedom in a second and who have us under assault right now in the cyber dimension through strategic influence operations to divide us as a people, to create despair among the populations in the democratic process itself, and ultimately to lose confidence that a democracy can even function. And if we don't think that that's an explicit outcome of the strategic influence operations of the Russians and the Chinese, then we're just not paying attention. And so they have seen the light of the divisions in the American society and those of our allies overseas. And they're driving the wedges in between those components of our population, increasing the divisiveness to the point where the absence of civility and the absence of respect in our discourse among our people. It used to begin with maybe a difference of opinion and we could exchange views and maybe someone would change their opinion. Now that difference of opinion means that we're enemies. We have got to change that if we're ever going to have the kinds of stable democracies that the question implies that we need to have. But it's really important that we don't despair. There is so much that's good about our respective democracies. And as I said before, we didn't arrive here on the 5th of January. So we need to understand what actions we have to take as a people if we're going to solve those problems to prevent another 5th of January from happening.
Well, gentlemen, we're out of time. You've sounded the warning for the Western powers, and you've offered a number of solutions, and now it's up to those in positions of authority to act. To everyone watching, thanks for tuning in. A reminder that in the chat column, you can find a link for purchasing copies of Future War and the Defense of Europe. From all of us here at Politics and Prose, stay well and well read.
Thank you, Brad.